My name is Rand Brenner. I'm CEO of Licensing Consulting Group. This is Greg Pfeiffer. He's the partner with Mueller-Prost. And today we're going to be having a workshop entitled How to Turn Your R&D Expenses into Tax-Free Licensing Revenue. And so how the workshop is going to work today, Greg is going to start us off, and he's going to be talking about the tax credit side of this workshop. And he'll get into the nuts and bolts of what the tax credit program is, how it works, what qualifies for it, and all of those things that are involved on the tax side. And after Greg is done, then I'll come up and talk about licensing as a strategy and how to use to take advantage of the R&D tax credits and commercializing or bringing your IP to market using licensing in ways in which you can really capitalize on this R&D tax credit. So with that, I'll turn it over to Greg. And I think, Greg, you said that we can take questions during the presentation. It kind of adds to, if you have a question come up, go ahead and ask it, because it'll add to the presentation and make it relevant to what you're actually working with.
Thank you, everyone, for coming here today. I know quite a few of you traveled a great distance, so we really appreciate that. And I met Rand through some networking events, and we got to talking, and as I understood more of what he did, and he understood more of what one area of our CPA firm does, the research tax credits, it just made a lot of sense to come together and put a presentation for you folks and just see where it goes. And as Rand says, as you have questions, feel free to ask. If I'm going to cover it later in the presentation, I'll let you know that. And the idea is we'll give you a little bit of information, but really the learning is going to happen afterwards and when we sit down later as well. So thank you, everyone. So I think this is a no-brainer question, but would you be interested to know that $7.5 billion in tax credits are issued by the government each year, research tax credits? Would you be interested to know if and how you could qualify for those tax credits? Of course. Approximately 80% of those go to some of the largest companies in the U.S. So that'd be your big boys across all the industries, your Apples, your Amazons, your Googles, and so on and so forth. But the flip side of that is 20% goes to small and middle-sized companies. So it's not just exclusively a large company, private, publicly traded benefit. It's available to all industries and all sizes, and at that point it comes down to, are you doing the qualified activities, and to what extent are you doing the qualified activities? So we'll spend some time today talking about what qualifies for the credit, and then we'll walk through how you claim the credit, and then give you an example of what that potentially could look like. So why is the R&D credit important? Well, I already mentioned the first fact. I'm going to try not to get in anybody's way here, but it's available to all size companies in all industries. It really comes as a benefit to the small to mid-sized companies because it's money that they can count on. It's an opportunity to claim the credit annually going forward, and then as you'll see, you can go back for all open tax years as well if you haven't claimed it historically. So it's a dollar for dollar credit. If you owe $100 in tax and you have $100 in research credit, you can get that to zero. There is a federal program, which I'll primarily focus on, and then 35 states have similar programs, California being arguably the best state program as well. Tax credits can be carried forward up to 20 years. So if you aren't able to utilize all of your credit that you generate in year one or going back, you're able to carry forward the tax credits up to 20 years. So it's something that even though you may be starting up, you may have losses, eventually the game is, let's generate some taxable income, and these credits will be there to offset that. As I mentioned, you can go back for 3 years, or for California, 4 years. If you've had a history of net operating losses, there's some special rules that allow you to go back even further than that to claim those credits and carry those forward as well. And as Rand said, it offsets a portion of your R&D. And ultimately, when you go to value a company, values of companies are determined on cash flow. This being a way to generate and or save cash that increases your cash flow, thereby it just increases the value of your company and organization. So the legal law and regulations is Internal Revenue Code, Section 41. As I mentioned, the credit is based on qualified research activities. There are 3 types of expenditures that we'll talk about that qualify for the credit, and the form on the federal side that you file the credit on is Form 6765. Yes?
In the past, has tax credits kind of been an on again, off again thing?
Yes.
Is this a permanent thing, or?
Yeah, so it's one of those great, historically it's been one of those great political chips, that has been renewed and expired every couple of years. So the credit itself has been around since 1981. In 2001, they changed the rules, which made it available to companies that were not necessarily inventing something new to the industry, it just had to be new to that company. So big change. So 2001 is when it really opened up to small businesses. At this point in time, the credit is permanent, and then with the Tax Act, it's set to expire in 2025. Now the reality is there's all sorts of lobbying efforts that's probably not going to happen, but right now that's the rule that is in play currently. But everything that we're hearing in the industry, everybody that we're talking to, it's becoming again that political chip, and that will not necessarily be ultimately what happens. So the 4-part test. This is at the heart of the credit. So there's a 4-part test. There has to be a qualified purpose. There has to be it has to be technological in nature. There has to be a process of experimentation, and that process of experimentation needs to eliminate some sort of uncertainty. And I'll go into each of these four parts in more detail over the next several slides. So qualified purpose. This is very simply, there has to be a development or improvement of a business component. So development or improvement, those are key. It doesn't have to be new, it just has to be something that you're improving. And then a business component is simply a product, a process, technique, formula, invention, or software. And you can have separate business components. Say you're manufacturing a new medical device, you can have the medical device be a business component, and you can have the manufacturing process be a business component as well. Or a particular aspect of the medical device, if that's unique, that could be a business component also. Technological in nature. So the process of experimentation to develop or improve your business component must rely on a hard science. So that's your typical hard sciences: chemical, physical, computer engineering, biological. Basically what that's saying is it can't be the humanities, the market research side of it. It has to be something in the hard science realm. Elimination of uncertainty. So this and the next test, process of experimentation, are really the two crux of the research tax credit. So there has to be some sort of uncertainty associated with the development or improvement of your business component. So that uncertainty can be in one of three different forms, and those are at the bottom. It's capability, method, or, and I said or, design. So capability, are we even able to do this new product or process? Method, how are we going to develop this new product or process? Design, what is that going to look like? So what we often find is that there's many uncertainties in all of these categories, but a lot of times people are like, yeah, we can get there, but we don't know how we're going to do that, or we don't know what that's going to look like. So there has to be this element of uncertainty. There is not a required threshold. It just has to be present and not necessarily quantified in any way, shape, or form. And then the fourth test, the process of experimentation. To resolve that uncertainty, there should be a process of experimentation. Makes sense. If it's research, that means there has to be more than just looking at something and saying, let's just change the color and we'll be done. So the process of experimentation has to involve either prototyping, modeling, simulation, or a systematic trial and error approach. And those are all or situations. It doesn't have to be all of that. So most of the time, small and mid-sized companies do have some sort of, ideally in med tech, med device, it's very structured, the development process. But in manufacturing, sometimes some certain aspects of a dental laboratory, it may not be as structured. So that's where you can qualify still with the systematic trial and error. Very important to note that it goes beyond traditional lab time. We're not just talking white coats and beakers. It's folks out on the shop floor. It's individuals, engineering teams. It's those supervising those engineering teams. So it's more than just your typical basic research. It's basic and applied. And that research must relate to new or improved function, performance, reliability, or quality. There's a reason that you're developing or improving what you are. More likely than not, it's going to be one of those reasons below.
Yes. So, for example, let's say that we are adding a feature to a device, say a single-use device, that we've experimented on, and from what I read from bullet number 2 is that if I then have because you mentioned something about marketing, if I'm having to do the evaluation of the experimentation output with a group of, I'm making this up of course, 5 key opinion leader physicians to look at the device, handle it, write down feedback, talk about case studies where it could apply, that cost me 10 grand, let's say.
Yeah.
Is that qualified?
So any good tax law says it depends. That's right. So the act of just what you described, if we just left it at that, you're just basic market research, that would not necessarily apply in this situation. Now, if they were your alpha and beta test and the feedback that they were giving you, then you turned around and improved your product as a result of that feedback, then they would be a part of that process of experimentation. So then we could capture a portion of those costs.
So you're defining research as related to a new or improved function. What I described to you in my world would qualify.
So if it was kind of like what I described, then yeah. I mean, it would have to be for that particular, just meet the 4-part test. That's all.
It would have to be a pilot.
Yeah.
So a pilot would not be market research. That would actually be, to your point, an alpha or a beta. And then that, I think, would qualify. Versus market research would be, I could get a group together of physicians and nurses, and that would be.
Yeah. Now, a pilot can include, which is what I just described. And the simple reason for that is that when you go from Rev A to Rev B, before you build it, and you've got data on Rev A, you've got to be able to know whether or not it can apply on a patient. And so in a pilot study, that would, in my world, it would apply. That's why I'm asking, because you sometimes cannot go further without having a professional look at the device and feel it, place it, push it, and to me that would qualify, but I understand.
Yeah, it all comes back to what's the intent and how are you going to use that information, so.
How about like clinical trials? Like to your point, you go through like a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and for certain benchmarks you have to go through, if not testing, validation.
Right.
4 phases.
Yeah. How would it work in that capacity?
Yeah, so we've actually, we've done claimed the clinical trial for development in that type of situation.
And certainly animal studies, let's say we're doing something with, I'm making this up again, with porcine valves. You know, we're having to model a device to deploy, say a valve into an animal heart, big heart. That would qualify as well, I would agree.
Oh yeah. Yes?
Who decides?
So everything is governed by the regulations on 6765, IRC 41. So basically, it's like any other tax provision in code where we've got folks that are working with the business owners to take, the position that's in accordance with the regulations. And then if that comes under audit, then it's, subject to the audit.
So they're the final ruling with the IRS.
Yeah, it's the same as like meals, entertainment, or travel expenditures.
But
or anything
you
like that.
blend your expertise with your competent analysis and assessment and documentation.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly.
Just one other question, excuse me, on this. So let's say, for example, I'm doing the research for, I've been contracted to do the actual research for the company to get to proof of concept. I'm, again, just modeling something here.
Sure.
And the company that has contracted us to do that can take advantage of this write-off. What about the contractor?
So research can only be claimed on one side, so you can't double dip that way. So yeah, great questions. So examples of qualifying activities, we've covered a lot of these. You know, developing new products, tools, processes, looking for manufacturability, testing different materials, different manufacturing methods, you know, additive manufacture, 3D printing. And there, the last one, testing new tool designs through sample testing and trials. You kind of get the idea. We can go more in depth. On the software side, so there is a delineation between software that is held for sale and then internal use software. Software that's held for sale, you just have to meet the traditional 4-part test. And you've got any of your basic development techniques and processes would qualify for that as well. Non-qualifying activities. I hit on you know, the market research and some of those. Research related to style, and this may kind of you know, dip into your question too. Research related to style, taste, cosmetic, or seasonal design factors. So by taste, they mean preference. So if it's truly, and which one do you like? Do you like the blue or do you like the red better? Not qualified. But if there's a functional aspect, then it would be qualified. The point in time is commercial production. That's the key. Anything prior to commercial production is potentially qualifying research. And then once it hits commercial production, then it's not qualifying research. Now, say for instance, you've hit commercial production, you're moving along, you discover that there's a part failing, and then you have to redesign that part. The redesign of that particular part would be another business component. So you'd start the clock until you get that worked out. Adaptation and duplication is not allowed. There's a, you know, adaptation is if you're not improving the function, reliability, performance, or quality. So a lot of times there's some discussion spent on, is this an adaptation or is this a new business component? And that's where we really have to dig deep in and say, okay, have I changed anything that potentially could affect the performance, the quality, the reliability of this product as a whole? The process of reverse engineering is not qualified. Surveys, so again, you know, it's an area that we'd want to explore and get pretty deep on to understand everything going on, potentially. The research has to occur in the US. We talked about the humanities, and then it can't be funded by, specifically funded by grant, contract, or similar.
So I've got a question for you here, if I may.
Yeah.
So how do you define, if you go back one slide, how do you define commercial production? And let me just give you the reference point. That would be, if I'm in the pre-production phase of a 5-gate process, and I'm producing the first 500 to go to market beta testing in 2 states.
Not commercial production yet.
Okay, thank you. That's what I wanted to understand, because it's pre-production, and so your advice would be, hey, you're not fully released, and it's not being promoted yet,
Right.
but it is being beta tested.
Yep.
Okay,
Exactly. Okay, so the types of expenditures, predominantly it's the wages, and then you've got supplies, and then you've got contract research. Wages, it's not only the folks that are performing the research, but it's those that are directly supervising them and those that are supporting them. So it literally could be a situation where you've got you know, an engineer who's performing the research, their direct supervisor that's supervising that, and then you may have somebody supporting that by taking results or entering those into the system and recording those types of activities. So it's those three buckets of individuals. Supply costs, pretty self-explanatory. And then contract research, Henry, like you would describe as if somebody hired you as a 1099 to assist in the research efforts, or you outsource certain aspects of the testing to a laboratory or something like that. We'll walk through the actual example of a calculation, but in essence, there's the current year qualified research. It's compared to a base amount, and then whatever's over and above that base amount, you get your credit computation off of that, and then that's used to offset tax. The base amount, if you've been in existence for a long time, you are considered either a non-startup, which is 1984 to 1988, if you were in business then doing research. A startup would be any other company. And then there's something now called the Alternative Simplified Credit, which gives a base period definition of the 3 prior years. For qualified small businesses, so this would, in the traditional sense of a startup company, for those that are either pre-revenue or early stage, you can make an election to use these research credits to offset the employer portion of payroll taxes. So this is a new rule, and that offset is capped at $250,000. So if you are truly in the development process, you're going along, it's going to take 3 years to develop, you're paying your folks pre-revenue, this is an option to offset your as employer portion of your payroll taxes. Sample calculation. So it doesn't really matter how you get there. At the end of the day, I'm just using an example of $1 million of qualified research expenditures. How I came up with that in this particular example is there's a team of 10 engineers making $95,000 each. They're spending greater than 80% of their time on research. I point that out because per the regulations, if you're greater than 80% of time on your research, you're deemed to be 100% on research. And then you've got some supply costs and then some outsourced 1099 or laboratory costs of $5,000. All goes into the bucket to equal $1 million. And over the last 3 years, if you're $1 million this year, it was 900, 800, 700, the 3 prior years, just for illustrative purposes. So the computation, and I'm using the alternative simplified credit. Computation is you take your $1 million, you look at the average for the last 3 years and divide that by half. And then you look at what's over and above your average. So you're looking at, let's see if I got my pointer here. I don't know which one is the pointer. This one? Yeah. So you've got your $1 million of qualified research expenditures. You've got your base period calculation ultimately of 400,000. And then so you look at the $1 million less the 400, and that gets you to 600,000 of current year qualified research expenditures, multiplied by the credit percentage. So that's regular credit of 84,000. And when you're filing on an amended return, you effectively tax affect that. So your cash in hand, your actual tax credit on original return is 66,000 for $1 million in QREs. So it's a very solid program. And then you not only get year 1, you can go back for all open tax years as well, which may be 3 years on the federal side, 4 years for California in particular. Common industries, manufacturing. 2/3 of the folks that claim this credit are somehow in manufacturing. That would include medical device. We've got life sciences, biotech, pharma, software developers, dental laboratories, prosthetic laboratories, health and beauty, aerospace, plastics, etc. So very, very common to see this in many different industries, including design build contractors too. And that's me. So Any questions now? If not, I'll definitely be around after and get more in detail.
Okay, so now that we've talked about the tax credit side, what we're going to look at is from a strategy side and using this from a licensing standpoint and what you can do with it, especially as a startup or an operating business if you're looking for a way to expand your business or find a way to capitalize on this. So really, it's about how you can take this knowledge of understanding what you can do with your R&D. And keep in mind, for a lot of this IP, the predominant expense is R&D. I mean, of course, you've got other expenses in there, but it's R&D. So when we look at it, we'll look at it from the standpoint of IP, how it's used, the R&D spending and IP strategy, and how to use licensing to capitalize on the R&D. So real quick, my company, I work on consulting strategy, IP due diligence, and licensing management. I do a lot of licensing predominantly, but there is still considerable consulting, a variety of different technologies from surgical devices, medical devices, oral health care, consumer products. So I've seen a lot of different technologies. One thing I do see that's all in common is that the bulk of expenses that clients have spent have been focused on developing that technology or that core product for obvious reasons because it's needed to sell. So there's an opportunity to claim a lot of these tax credits. And the question is, what do all these companies have in common? Oh, come on. You've got to know the answer. Intellectual property and licensing. Okay? They all developed intellectual property and used licensing at some level and still continue to do that today. And hand in hand with that is the opportunity for many of them to claim the tax credit, because a lot of the activities associated with developing that IP and licensing it out, as I'm going to talk about, part of licensing, of course, is looking at new opportunities and ways to expand that licensing program to generate even more revenues, which leads you back to improving your innovation, developing new types of IP. So what can you do with IP? You can do a lot of things with IP, a lot more than I think many people even realize what they can do with it. But what we're going to be focusing on today really is from the strategic partnership standpoint and licensing. How is IP used? And one of the things to keep in mind is to really understand that IP is an asset. It's a strategic asset. It's the most important asset of every company today. When you look at big companies, the top companies, you hear about Microsoft and Google and Facebook. I mean, what are these companies? I mean, Google and Facebook don't really make anything. They're just IP companies. They're pure IP plays, as is Microsoft and a number of other companies. Sure, they package up their IP, put it in different products, but it's the core underlying thing is it's all about intellectual property. Microsoft wouldn't be here today if Bill Gates hadn't done his licensing deal to get the IP that he used to license out to IBM. And that was what set him off to create the world's largest software company. And for most startups, small businesses, mid-sized businesses, really the emphasis is on the IP, and this is a study that was done, is really on the monetary side. How am I going to make money with this IP? The big companies look at it for strategic purposes. Oftentimes they get these big patent portfolios to block, set up competitive barriers, sue one another, whatever the case is. But for small firms, it's really about how am I going to make money with this IP? And that's why licensing, especially licensing out, is done more by small companies than large companies. And that's because the value of IP rights today exceeds the value of products. It's what's inside the product. You look at your smartphones, you look at your computers, you look at your clothes, you look at anything around you today, and the value isn't in the tangible physical embodiment of it, it's in the IP rights that are inside it. And you can get a sense of this every day when you read the news, because you read the news about litigation that goes on constantly. I mean, Microsoft, or Apple and Qualcomm have been battling for years and years and years, and they finally settled it. What have they been battling over? Royalties for the use of Qualcomm chips inside of Apple's phone. So this battle that goes on, it's not over the phones, it's not over anything but the rights to use this IP. That's where the value exists. So the first question that you have to ask yourself is, what is your IP strategy? Everybody talks about business strategy, everybody talks about marketing strategy. But what a lot of companies fail to do is to talk about IP strategy. And when you talk about IP strategy, this ties directly back in to what you're doing with your R&D. Because your R&D is what gets you there. So you can make and sell it, which a lot of companies elect to do. I'm going to build a business and go out and sell it. You can generate licensing revenue, or you can maximize your return on investment through the R&D and the IP. And so when you think about licensing, there's 3 reasons that you want to consider licensing. The first is size, is how big are you? If you're a small fish going into a very large pond with very big competitors, you likely don't have exclusivity in that market. So you're going to be up against a tough road. And that leads to point number 2, which is your capabilities. Do you have all the resources that you need? And when you talk about, and you look at your IP, and we talk about this R&D, where is all your money going when you're a startup predominantly at the start? It's going in to develop whatever your technology is. Well, once you get to a certain point, where is the money coming from for all the other rest of the, what they call complementary assets you're going to need to get it into the marketplace? For a lot of companies, that's where they run out of money, because it's very expensive oftentimes to get the distribution or the marketing or the production or the regulatory approval or whatever it is. So that's the second reason that it is. And then the third, and I commented on this, is who's your competition? Because if your competition are the big heavyweights, like if you look at the medical device industry where there's a lot of upstarts coming in, there's also giant, huge behemoths that are in this industry moving in very aggressively because they see what's coming. So you have to evaluate where your company is going to be versus these companies. And in a few slides, I'm going to show you how this all feeds into capitalizing on your R&D. So to give you a picture of how small businesses and mid-sized businesses use their IP, this is a survey. This is from various surveys that were done by small and mid-sized businesses, both in the US and in Europe. And what's striking about it is they're similar. They do it for the same reasons. Most of them, most often, it's for monetary purposes and it's for generating revenue, a lot of the time through licensing. Now, they're also used to attract investors and to access capital. But you can see that through these studies, they've seen that small businesses recognize and use licensing as a way to generate money. That makes sense when you consider that a lot of them have limitations and capabilities and they're up against big competition. Does that make sense? So how you capitalize on your IP is really capitalizing on your R&D, because that's where your dollars are going in. And the way to do that is licensing generates, think of it this way, licensing, when you use licensing, you're generating cash flow. That cash flow can be used to finance your innovation. Because when you finance your innovation, that means you can build upon it, expand upon it, and create more opportunities to generate more cash flow. And that's taking advantage of your R&D. So now what happens is you're turning your focus with all the money that comes in from, I'm going to put the money into IP initially, and then go into building a business, which means I'm going to dump money into all the things that I can't really recapture. I can only hope I can win at the sales level, and focus on putting the money on the IP and expanding that. And as you do that, you're focusing on the R&D side, which is going to give you an opportunity to capitalize more and more on the R&D tax credits. You have a question?
Yeah. On the previous slide, just a question on the bullet, reduce, let's see.
Reduce the cost of raising capital.
Can you elaborate on that?
Well, oftentimes when you get it, when you look at financing, and especially for those who are in the financing business, what companies are raising capital that tend to attract capital more often? Those are the companies that have IP, that have patents, that have some technology. So they're the ones who are going to have access to capital, often at what's called a reduced rate, meaning it's not going to cost them so much because the perceived risk of having an IP is lower than not having an IP. In other words, if you were in a commodity business with no IP and you went out to raise capital, you're going to be looked at as a very high-risk business because you're up against competition. You have to spend a lot of money to compete on price, let's say, which is a very hard model as opposed to having a patent, which gives you an exclusive area in the marketplace. Make sense? Okay. So the first step in looking at your IP is to figure out what you've got. Because as Greg pointed out, there's a lot of pieces that go inside of the R&D tax credit. And for many companies, many businesses, many IP owners, they don't even understand what they've put into their IP. And the only way you're going to discover what's in that IP and take advantage of the R&D tax credits is to do what's called an IP audit. That's basically just creating a database of all your IP and everything that you've done to create that IP. And as you do that IP audit, by the way, you're going to discover a lot of interesting opportunities that you can do, not only with your IP, but where you can focus on improving, expanding, capturing more R&D tax credits, because this is going to give you a tool that you're going to be able to look at and say, all right, where can we go with this? The audit is something that's not used very much. Many companies don't even know about it. In fact, when I work with some clients, I have to take some time assembling the information on the IP, just little things such as the paperwork from the patents. Do you have trademarks? Where are you holding your copyrights? Do you have whatever the case is? It's kind of scattered all over the place. But when you look at taking advantage of the R&D tax credits, you really have to go in and start taking a look at everything that you've put into that, because that's really where you're going to capture and start to maximize your return on your investment. Your IP is an investment, so you want to maximize the return. Oftentimes it's thought of, all I have to do is get the IP, build the product, sell it, that's how I'm going to get my return. But that's only a part of the return. You're missing a big chunk on the R&D side. And this is where you start to be able to figure out what is it that I'm missing and how can we capitalize on it. So really what you want to do is you want to focus on expanding your IP technology into new markets, uses, and applications. And that's how some of the biggest companies today make their money. Intel, for one. Intel doesn't make products. They go inside the products. But what they do is they spend millions in development work, working with other companies to help them develop their technologies, their IP, so that they can stick their chips inside their products. And I'm sure that they capture a lot of R&D tax credits doing this. And that's an example of an innovation company that's focusing on, yes, they sell their products, but what their focus is on licensing those chips out to the computer companies, the phone companies, you name it. Everybody uses the chips today. And that's an example of how you capitalize on your R&D, how you get the maximum return on your IP. So licensing is better because, first of all, it's an alternative to competing directly. Today, it's very tough to compete, especially if you're up against big competitors. It's a cooperation strategy. And here's the difference between licensing and selling. When you license, you're getting a piece of the market. You may have one or more licensees. When you're making and selling, you're getting a sales price for a product you sell to an individual customer or multiple customers. There's a big difference between getting revenue from a market and getting revenue from customers. And that's the difference. When you look at somebody like Intel or even Qualcomm, where are they getting their money from? They're not getting their money from selling chips one at a time to customers. They're getting their money from the entire market by licensing it out, licensing rights to use it. And that's a model being adopted more and more by companies because they see there's more value, first of all, in bringing in money through licensing revenue. Second, focusing on their technology and building it out and discovering new uses, taking advantage of R&D, maximizing the return on their IP, than there is trying to go out and build and compete against other companies. And through licensing, the price that you get is basically what you negotiate. It's a royalty rate that gives you a percentage or a piece of what that company is generating. And licensing has been around for a long time. Many people don't realize it goes way back, and it's used in many different ways. This is one story about two huge companies in the early 1800s who were battling it out when the phones were emerging, but neither of them were making any money because they were too busy beating each other up. And eventually they settled it through a cooperation strategy where Bell took the phones and Western Union took the telegraphs, and Western Union got a percentage, 40% inside Bell. Who won that battle? But the point being is even companies, even back 200 years ago, companies were recognizing that the cooperative strategy often is a better way to go, especially if you want to maximize the return on your IP, on your R&D investments. And the other thing that happens, especially for companies that develop an IP, and everybody's IP is a breakthrough technology, right? We've all got disruptive technologies. We're going to change the market. We're the next Facebook or Google. But the truth is that 99% of most IP is incremental. It's not a breakthrough. It's very rare that you can get a breakthrough technology and shake up an industry. You see those breakthroughs because obviously they capture the news, the headlines, but most of the time it's an improver of some kind in an industry. Microsoft, when they came out with the DOS operating, that was a breakthrough. And a lot of other companies that became very large, their IP built on to Microsoft's DOS system and allowed them to grow. That's the difference. And it's something that you really have to take a look at it, because what happens for a lot of startups, they get out the door pretty fast and they think that they've got the market. They think that they're very competent in what they do, but they don't realize it's only temporary, because the market catches up fast when they see what's going on. And if you've only got, let's say, an incremental, really an improvement to something that's out there, they'll figure it out. And then what happens is suddenly the competition is coming, sales slow down, and before you know it, it's not working so well as Netscape found out. When they had a licensing offer from Microsoft, but they decided, nope, we're going to go head-to-head because we can beat them. Didn't work out that way. They got clobbered in the late 90s as the battle for the browser standards came into the forefront. And of course, Microsoft had Windows, or what do they have, Explorer, which beat out Netscape. And of course, Netscape is kind of faded out. I don't know, anybody still using Netscape? It's gone away. But this is a great example of why you have to really take a look at the market and say, where does my IP stand in the market? How am I going to get the biggest return on it? And is going head-to-head going to be the best way to do it? In this situation, what happens to your money? You've put all that money in the R&D, but now the rest of the money you're putting in, you're not going to capture anything on it. You're too busy trying to fight with the competition, hoping to stay alive. And I'm not sure, Greg, if marketing and advertising dollars qualifies for. And so, you got these huge amount of expenses going out. Whereas a licensing model, had they done the licensing, they could have really captured a lot of value on their IP. So, some points that I wanted to make about the licensing business, because yes, licensing is big business. Yes, it's a great strategy, a great way to go, but it does have its challenge. The first thing to understand is that licensing is supply-driven and not demand-driven. Yes, there is demand for new, great innovation, new technologies, but it's not like companies are hanging out signs saying, wanted this kind of technology. I mean, it's there. It's more often the case that somebody shows up with a great technology that they get interested in, such as myself, who goes out for clients and presents an IP. I find that all the time. Companies want new innovation, but they don't know what they're looking for till it arrives. And even then, they don't even recognize it. So that's one of the, and that creates a big challenge, and that is finding licensing partners, because if these companies don't know what they want, how the heck are you supposed to find them? And a lot of what goes on in the licensing business is very fragmented. It's all over the place. Sometimes it's like a pinball bouncing off of the bumpers, trying to figure out who's going to get what, not only in the industries, but inside the companies themselves. Because it's a business that suddenly has come to the forefront for a lot of companies, especially those big companies that are pulling out of R&D because they just can't move fast enough anymore. And now they want to form strategic partnerships with startups and small businesses and do licensing, but they don't have any kind of formalized intake process. Well, they sign it to so-and-so over here, but when an IP lands on their desk, they don't know what to do with it. Or it doesn't fall in my division. Or I don't handle that. Or any number of things that go on inside these large organizations. So it runs into some roadblocks. But the good news is, if you're licensing in the United States, you stand a higher chance of doing a deal than you do outside the United States. The reason is Europe, for example, it's much lower rates. Why? Because It's a lot of different countries. It's very fragmented. The structural makeup there makes it a lot more difficult to do licensing dues, so they have a lower rate as opposed to in the United States. It's not to say that you can't do them there, but it moves faster. It moves slow in the U.S., but not as slow as outside the U.S. So real quick, for those that don't, maybe not familiar with the licensing process, I mean, it's buyers and sellers. The buyer is the licensee, the one who gets the rights, and the seller is the licensor, the IP owner. And basically what they're when somebody licenses your IP, they're getting rights to exploit it, and they're going to pay you a fee, whether it's a royalty rate, a fixed fee, a hybrid, something like that. And in return, you're going to give them technical assistance, consulting, whatever it is, to make sure that the IP, they're successful with it. And then along the way, you're also going to be working on innovating, developing your IP as well, which brings you back to looking at things that you're going to be doing with them that maybe you could now go back in and start looking at more tax credits as you develop it for the market with them. I think that qualifies if I'm understanding it correctly. So again, this is where licensing allows you to really leverage up that ROI on your IP. So one of the strategies to think about, and it's an important strategy to think about, and many companies miss this, is really when you look at licensing, think of it from a niche market standpoint. Think of it from the standpoint of a technology that's been developed. When you go to a company and offer them your IP, and you say, okay, here's an IP your customers are going to love. They don't need another product or software that their customers are going to love, because they're hanging on to those customers. They're already keeping them happy. But what they don't have is technologies to address new customers coming into the market. A lot of startups come in and they squeeze into these big markets because you're addressing some unmet customer need somewhere, which eventually the big company catches up. So when you go out to license, the question is really, what are we offering them? What unmet need are we offering them that we can address with this IP? That's what you have to think about. You know, do we lower costs, lower liability, increase revenues, reach a target, fix something, do something better, whatever the case is. That's the way that you are able to position your IP for the most success, because as I said, a lot of these companies, they can't do the research anymore to reach these new customer segments. They have to rely on the outside, and that's the way you have to think of your IP. You have to go beyond just, it's just a brace or a sling or whatever. I'm using those as an example, but sometimes you have a lot of other market applications or multiple market. Those are what you have to think of, because those could be some of the best. And when you look at some of these companies and how they use licensing to really build themselves out and expand and create a market for themselves, when you look at their technology, somebody like Nintendo doesn't make any games. They have a game platform. And what they do is they license hundreds of companies to make games for their game platform. They have a lot of R&D going on. And what that has done is it's created a huge market position, because now you've got a lot of companies making games for them, and it allowed them to position their platform as a standard in the industry and become, along the way, one of the largest game platforms in the world. And I share that with you so you get a sense of how you could use intellectual property and think about intellectual property. I mean, they could have just as easily thought of themselves as a video game company and gone out and started building video games, and probably got clobbered along the way with all the other video game companies. Instead, they looked at themselves as a platform company. Much as Apple doesn't build all the apps, they have an entire licensing process for all the apps, as Google does for Android. So these are things that you need to think about with your IP. What are the ways we can use it? Are there ways that we can license it where others can build upon it? So in wrapping this up, in looking at leveraging up your IP, looking at taking advantage of all the R&D, of really expanding upon those R&D credits, is think of yourself, especially if you've got a lot of IP, as an innovation factory, because that's what companies are looking for, innovation factories. That means that you're focusing on R&D and licensing partnerships. And by doing that, first of all, you're going to avoid the costly competition, especially if you're up against bigger companies like Microsoft and Netscape. Second of all, you're going to avoid wasting all that money in trying to build the competencies, the infrastructure to try to get your product to market. Especially because a lot of times those are sunk costs. You can't capture those back, and it can be very expensive. You can avoid that. There's a lot of companies, I like to say, that already have a wheel rolling. So why should you reinvent that wheel? Why not partner with a company that's already got it there? And so the question really comes down to not whether or not to pursue licensing, but when and how to start licensing your IP. So that's it for my portion of the presentation. For those that have not signed up yet, I offer a newsletter on licensing. Comes out about once a week, offering strategy tips, things on licensing. I encourage you to sign up. And before I open it up to questions, I first want to thank our sponsors, Dan Golka with World MedTech and MedTech Count Directory, and Cassandra, who is doing the video back here. Thank you very much. If you're looking for somebody to handle your video, please go talk to her. And with that, if there's any questions, Greg and I are here to take the questions. Otherwise, we can wrap it up and have some water and beer.